Spoiler note, this video alludes to story details from Metroid Prime 4, including a specific discussion of the ending. I strongly urge you to finish the game before watching. Kensuke Tanabe's recent interview with Nintendo Dream has now been translated into English, courtesy of Darts via Shinesparkers. And as I usually like to do with these, I thought it would be worth reading through it and unpicking it because it does shed quite a lot of light on some key decisions, and I think it is probably one of the best developer deep dive interviews we've had of this kind, particularly with regard to Metroid Prime. Some of the highlights include discussions of sequel possibilities, the design philosophies of many aspects of the game, and the very deep origins of the Viola motorbike and Sol Valley and more. Let's start by meeting the people who are interviewed. We have Kensuke Tanabe, the producer, who as it says works for Nintendo and has acted as producer on the Metroid Prime series and many other games, including of course Luigi's Mansion and Dylan's Rolling Western. There's Bill Vandervoort, the design director, who works for Retro Studios and had a level design role on Metroid Prime The Corruption and on the Donkey Kong Country games. Then Kenji Yamamoto on music, works for Nintendo and has composed the music of many Metroid titles, starting with Super Metroid. So first of all, I'm really pleased that as well as Tanabe, we get Vandervoort and Yamamoto involved in this interview as well, because I always find it interesting when we meet all of the different people who are involved in Nintendo's games. This appears as well to be an email interview. I'm not sure how standard this is and what the process is for these kind of interviews where different people are speaking back and forth in different languages. Does one person in Japan translate and handle the correspondence back and forth before it goes to the press, or is it a little freer than that? I guess that's a Kit and Krista question, but I guess the heart of my interest is how much Nintendo has moderated what has been said before it actually goes out. Now, the first question delves into something I always find interesting, specifically how the collaboration with Retro actually works in practice. Referenced in here are the trio of next-level games developers from Federation Force who came over support on Metroid Prime 4 initially, Matt McTavish, Kevin Yen, and Mark Bianchin, plus a special thanks was given to Alex McFarlane. So let's read this rather exhaustive answer first, and then we'll analyse because there's an awful lot here. Tanabe says, when development started at Retro Studios, the staff from Nintendo was mainly me as producer and Mr. Bata both as assistant producer and in charge of progress management, along with Mr. Yamamoto on sound, Mr. Takayoshi Sato on art supervision, and initially a single interpreter. Later, we added to the team one interpreter coordinator, one English text translator, and in the final stage of development, one more person for coordination support and one in charge of debugging. We also had the help of several other members who provided support on art supervision, as well as the technical side of things. On Retro Studios' side, over 100 internal employees were involved in the development. For some time, they also collaborated with 3 game designers from Next Level Games. A lot of the work was outsourced, particularly on the art and cutscene creation, resulting in a total of over 300 staff members. As for the development process itself, we at Nintendo first communicated the high-level concept for the game, its general structure, the setting, the worldview. We then asked Retro Studios to write the game's concrete specifications and create concept art, level design documents, prototypes, and so on, so that we could check them on our side, make some revisions, and request changes. Once they got the final okay from us, Retro Studios then worked on the actual implementation. We also followed the same process for the various ideas that came from Retro Studios. Furthermore, the data creation was entirely managed by Retro Studios, including outsourcing to companies, supervision, delivery, and so on. Retro Studios set up 3 separate reporting meetings with us, one for game design supervision, one for art supervision, and one for progress management, and they held each of them basically for a few hours once a week. During the COVID-19 pandemic, employees from both companies worked from home, and after the pandemic ended, in addition to the Zoom meetings, we would travel to Retro Studios several times a year and hold in-person meetings for 3 to 5 consecutive days in order to advance production. End quote. Okay, so there is an enormous amount in here. First of all, we learn that, yet again, the core team is actually quite small. Tanabe and Tabata plus Sato on art and Yamamoto on music, and one other translator. The addition of new people in translation roles over time shouldn't be overlooked, since after all, that is where Risa Tabata got her start, and as we'll see later in this interview, she is actually pretty much named as the successor on the franchise, but nevertheless, that seemed to be a function of the project taking so long, and I suspect was due to Tabata actually being internally promoted during the period of the game's development, ending up both as the producer of The Thousand Year Door and also working in the project management department for a number of other titles, which may have taken her away from the kind of intensive management she used to do in Austin. She unusually has 2 credits on Metroid Prime 4, only one of which is her traditional post of assistant producer, which supports the idea that her role changed significantly across the 8 years. Indeed, the fact that there are 3 different groups and only one of them is focused on the project progression makes me wonder whether she was more attached to that side of things, whereas Tanabe was focused more on the art and gameplay this time, even though we do know that in the past, Tabata has had quite significant input into the gameplay, particularly of Metroid Prime 3. Now, I find it intriguing that Next Level Games were involved from the off, but perhaps that isn't so surprising when you consider that the Federation Force themselves were clearly a long-standing idea of Tanabe's to develop, and so people with recent experience on Federation Force would have made sense to bring to Metroid Prime 4. Tanabe suggests that this was for some time, so my guess is that it might have been a transitional arrangement while Retro got up to speed, that Next Level Games were lending some people to work on the title. It probably helped that they and Retro are both English-speaking, of course, but note though that Next Level Games were not a part of Nintendo, not fully owned as a subsidiary, when Retro took over Metroid Prime 4. And it just shows all the more why Nintendo would have wanted to purchase them if they were so reliant on the group. Then there's the structure of Retro Studios itself, and I find this absolutely fascinating. 3 different working groups for game design, art, and progress management. This fits with the credits, which show no singular director from Retro, but 3 department leads, but still seems like an interesting way of subdividing the team, and I wonder whether this has implications for future projects, whether, say, the art team might be a cohesive enough unit to be assigned to assist on another project, while the core gameplay design team are working on concepts for a new title. This certainly seems to be the way things are operated in, let's say, EPD Group 5, where the core Animal Crossing and Splatoon teams would stick with their franchises come what may, but the art and music teams seem to focus on just one at a time, going to which game is in major development at any particular period. Now, that overlap seems to be getting less and less as of Splatoon 3, but it still makes sense if Nintendo wanted Retro to be resilient enough to have the capacity to handle multiple concurrent projects, that they would have these discrete groups. Also kind of interesting, one of my long-term investigations is into how Nintendo responded to the COVID pandemic, and although that video is something that has been in development for years and probably will be something I continue to develop over many years to come as more information very gradually trickles out about what happened during that period, we do learn that both Retro and Nintendo were working from home, although otherwise the process of the multiple longer trips per year seems to be consistent with the kind of development approach that has been talked about previously between Nintendo and Retro Studios. One other topic of interest to me is that Retro seem to handle most of the subcontracting themselves rather than this being the job of Nintendo. Now, this may make sense in many ways, as they need to have trusted relationships and they must have better contacts in America and the English-speaking world than Nintendo, who will be trying to micromanage it from across the Pacific Ocean. Next question. What is the meaning behind the subtitle Beyond? Tanabe responds, in this game, Samus is transported across time and space to a planet in another dimension called Vuros. We picked the English word that would best express this idea of across time and space. We particularly took into account the opinions of overseas employees from Retro Studios, Nintendo of America, and Nintendo of Europe, end quote. I can see from a narrative point of view it's elegant to hive off Vuros into another dimension, and the title Beyond seems as good as any. I am intrigued that they specifically reference Nintendo of Europe as being consulted, though. Although historically Europe hasn't got too involved with Metroid as far as we can tell, I assume that they may have much more to say since Spain's Mercury Steam team began working on the 2D games, as I guess they need to have Spanish-speaking regional managers. Perhaps, of course, it was just good practice to consult the European team as well, just to check how the title sounds in different languages, but it still caught my attention. Now, this next section is quite dense, so let's read first and then discuss. Please tell us about the design concepts for Samus's new suits, the Viola suit and the Legacy suit. So Bill responds, the designs of Samus's Viola suit and Legacy suit reflect their respective functions, but also the architecture and technology of each era of the Lamorn civilization. The sleek Viola suit is rooted in the Lamorn's machine era. While it incorporates elements from the Varia suit, it contrasts with it thanks to its curving lines and mechanical nuances. Given that the Viola suit allows Samus to ride Viola, we put a lot of emphasis on connecting the two visually. The Legacy suit, as the Lamorn's final gift to the Chosen One, Samus, provides her with a protective barrier. This suit's design reflects the organic aesthetic of their most sacred locations, the Temple of Memory and Chrono Tower. Nintendo Dream asks, how did the brand new bike Viola come to be? Tanabe responds, around 2016, when I was beginning to plan the game, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was getting a lot of praise for adopting an open-world format. Following that, I kept seeing comments online saying I want to try playing an open-world Metroid. However, Metroid's core concept of acquiring new abilities to expand the explorable space contradicts the go anywhere you want from the start structure of open worlds. Even so, I wondered, was there a way to meet these demands, if only in a limited area? I also thought that being able to exhilaratingly ride a bike through that area could add some variety to the pacing of Metroid's gameplay, which is usually all about claustrophobia and tension. However, when I later saw Link riding a bike in Breath of the Wild's DLC, my reaction was no! Now people will think I stole that idea, and I wasn't sure what to do. But then I thought, no, I'm not copying them, and besides, Samus riding a bike is definitely cool. And so, without further hesitation, I decided to make this bike a reality. Sol Valley, the area where you can ride the bike, was conceived with freedom of movement as the top priority, so I made it a wide open space without any roads or obstacles. It was essential that this area made you feel that, while driving, if something caught your eye, you could focus solely on driving towards it. If multiple objectives came into view, you end up distracted from your initial objective and you lose the excitement of gradually getting closer to your destination. To achieve this kind of experience, Retro Studios' Sol Valley team made brilliant use of the terrain's relief to ensure that you generally only have one objective at a time in your field of vision. At the same time, it made Sol Valley feel much larger than it actually is. I hope players can enjoy the feeling of blasting across this desolate land on Viola. As for why it's called Viola, I wanted to give the bike a somewhat unique name. Since I play the guitar, I figured, why not name it after a musical instrument? But using a guitar manufacturer's brand name was out of the question, and a guitar didn't really fit the bike. After giving it some thought, I went with an instrument whose name isn't as well known, but it has a nice ring to it, viola. It's pronounced viola, but who knows how the Lamorn actually said it. End quote. First of all, we have confirmation that the game began planning in 2016, presumably right after the end of Federation Force, although I'm sure that development process would have continued into early 2017 and around the launch of the Switch and Breath of the Wild. Now, I maintain that it's likely that the game wasn't formally commissioned by Nintendo until 2017, after they knew that the Switch and Breath of the Wild had been a success, but it does make sense that Tanabe was pitching the title at this point. Of course, 2016 was before Breath of the Wild's full release, so it was during that time that Nintendo basically dedicated an entire E3 to the one game, and the focus was very much on the next evolution of Zelda, so it does make sense that they would look to have other titles sync into this overall strategy for the next generation. Now, Tanabe is picking up a lot of flack these days for pushing open-world elements into Metroid. I've seen some people implausibly call Beyond itself an open-world game, which is obviously preposterous, but nevertheless, the elements that are open do seem to have been the direct proposal of Tanabe himself. However, another thought has occurred to me, which puts a different spin on the potential behind-the-scenes wrangling. We don't know exactly when Nintendo commissioned Metroid Prime 4, but we do know that it was announced extremely early in June 2017, and for quite a time there were more Switch Breath of the Wild sold than Switches. This was before Nintendo were in a position to greenlight everything under the sun. They were still crawling out of a considerable hole from the mid-2010s, but they did greenlight Metroid Prime 4 at this stage, and I wonder if part of the reason was that they thought that it might be able to provide another open-world string to their bow. In other words, was committing to some open element the thing that actually sealed the game's commission from Nintendo? And if Tanabe had not included this, might he have found that Metroid Prime 4 was overlooked once again? The way this interview reads, Tanabe clearly understands that openness of this kind cuts against the philosophy of the rest of the game. It feels a little to me like he was being asked to own the solution to the problem, even though he wasn't necessarily sure whether or not this was something that should be solved, although I'm sure once he thought about it, he committed to the solution he had. Now, on the other hand, we know from the previous Dylan Rolling Western interviews that Tanabe is a huge fan of Mad Max, and so clearly the specific implementation is his, and I have no doubt that he feels some pride in what is achieved with Soul Valley, even if not everybody has found it to their tastes. I find it incredibly striking that he didn't even pause when the Master Cycle Zero was revealed, not least because this is incredibly early in the game's development. The Champion's Ballad DLC, after all, released in December 2017, but Tanabe of course worked at Nintendo, so there's a very decent chance that he caught wind of their plans ahead of time, although it also seems to be the case that many of the departments are quite siloed off and don't particularly pay attention to the others. Now, this kind of puts pay to the idea, if there ever was one, that the motorcycle was something Retro specifically pursued. Also, while I'd speculated that the specific choice of a motorcycle as a vehicle might have been a later consideration, it appears that the opposite was the case, and it was indeed always a motorcycle rather than a different kind of vehicle. The idea of using the ups and downs of terrains to bring gameplay to barren areas is evidently an assignment given to Retro, and frankly, I think it was a tough ask, although I do understand completely the wish that players could simply see something on the horizon and head towards it. Now, with Breath of the Wild, this kind of freedom was offered by the climbing mechanic, but obviously that doesn't exist here, and I think that does limit to some extent the efficacy of this open world area. All credit, Tanabe basically owns the design choices here entirely, name and all. Personally, I don't think the motorcycle entirely worked, but I also like it when Nintendo developers are given the space to try things out, even if they ultimately fail, and I do find this a really interesting insight into the evolution of this core mechanic. Let's move on now, though, to Bill Vandervoort on the design of the locations. Nintendo Dream Ask. Now, about the game setting, Planet Viros. It is comprised of a variety of environments. Can you tell us about the creation process for each of these zones? Bill says, these zones have one central theme, which is to tell the story of the Lamorn's great tragedy through their environments. These places were inhabited by the Lamorn in different ways and for different reasons, and these reasons are often connected to what the player needs to achieve in-game. By experiencing firsthand the function of each zone and thoroughly scanning their surroundings, the player can gain a deeper understanding of the world around them, which makes it feel real. We also incorporated the concept of identity to each of the zones. In other words, we asked ourselves the following questions. What kind of place is this? What things could only happen here? What about it could leave a memorable impression on the player? We took familiar elements from our Earth and placed them in natural environments to make them unique. A factory in the middle of a thunderstorm, a laboratory atop a glacier, and artillery in the depths of a volcano. The colour scheme of each zone, down to how clear the sky is, was intentionally designed to be memorable and match the emotions felt by the player at every step of the journey. One area might evoke oppressing darkness, while another might convey a brighter sense of freedom, and of course, each zone also serves a purpose game-wise. The goals the player has to accomplish, the level of tension they're supposed to feel, the objectives needed to advance the story. We designed the structure and every component of each zone with all these aspects in mind. This process involved some extensive trial and error from a lot of people. To achieve this, we expressed in a few succinct phrases what kind of experience we were aiming for with each zone and used these as pillars around which to organize the team. End quote. So the color coding of various areas isn't entirely new to games, let alone Metroid Prime, but it's still definitely strongly evident in the title, and I also think it's great how dedicated Retro are to creating environments that feel cohesive between the natural and man-made worlds, or alien-made environments anyway. It's very evident from the game that the 5 Metroidvania areas play very differently, with Vault Forge using verticality, Fury Green being a very gentle introduction, and other areas focusing on puzzles, actions, and suspense. While people will have different perspectives on the regions as a whole, I think it's clear that they were successful in giving each a distinctive vision, and that they managed to orientate their large number of new staff into making each section stand out in its own way. This is promising to me in terms of what a future Retro Studios Metroid Prime game might achieve once all the people are on the same page to start with. Still, the reference to trial and error could be interpreted different ways. Iteration is always a key part of Nintendo's processes. How many of these interviews have we heard of turn over the tea table moments where a key assumption of what the game will be is flipped on its head? But with so many new people coming on board, it makes sense that the look of the game would be refined considerably over time. Now, the next section delves into the Lamorn people and is hugely spoilery, so if you ignored the spoiler warning at the top of the video, this is your last chance. The Lamorn's race, culture, and history, but also their demise, was some of the most impactful aspects of this game's story. How did you come up with their appearance and their lore? So Bill Vandervoort says, "We put a lot of thought into the Lamorn's design. The Lamorn were a peaceful, refined, cultured, and very spiritual people. Their religiousness was a central theme in the world building and is linked to many events that happened throughout their history. While the priests were the primary users of psychic energy, all Lamorn had the potential to manipulate it. All these elements were incorporated into the Lamorn's visual design. From the aquatic creature elements, the robes worn by the priests, the wavy arms suitable for handling psychic energy, the hidden mouth suggesting telepathic communication, it was also important that the Lamorn convey a sense of sanctity, to contrast with the Griever's corruption." Tanabe adds, "Once we decided to set this story in another dimension, and also that Samus would acquire psychic abilities there, the idea that Vurus's inhabitants built their civilization around these psychic abilities came naturally. However, since the idea for the bike came first, we also settled them once being a mechanical civilization, and that Viola was invented during that time. After all, I wanted to give Samus an emblematic enemy other than the pirates to fight, and while imagining what they could be, I was struck with the idea that the cause of the Lamorn's demise, the great tragedy, could be them transforming into Grievers. At the same time, I realized the green showers could be used to increase the difficulty level of the enemies in Sol Valley, and that was one of the deciding factors for establishing this backstory. Chayuta and the 12 other Lamorn, carrying with them miniature teleporters to return home, were sent to every planet across multiple universes to search for the Chosen One of the prophecy. Sadly, they were unable to find said Chosen One and all died in obscurity at their respective locations. This does mean, however, that there are still 11 teleporters in existence. It will be hard to create individual stories for all of them, but I think that still leaves the door open for exploring a few of them in the future." End quote. Okay, so the motorcycle really was at the heart of the construction, as it was necessary to have a mechanical civilization. Now, this kind of world building where form follows function isn't unusual for Nintendo by any means, and under the circumstances, it's probably to Retro's great credit that such a rich and detailed history of the Lamorn was woven around the starting point of the motorcycle. I think one of the strengths of Metroid Prime 4 is the development of the Lamorn and the tragedy of their corruption into becoming Grievers, so all credit to the team for building this out so effectively. Yet again, we get the confirmation, as I suspected before the game's release, that these psychic abilities came pretty early, perhaps first in the development, as these kinds of core gameplay actions are often the starting point for Nintendo. It occurs to me that just as the bike was influenced by the openness of Breath of the Wild, I do wonder if magnesis was an influence for the psychic powers Samus exhibits here. Of course, even if that's true, whether that was something Tanabe just hit upon or was encouraged to consider is impossible to say. The fact that there are 11 more teleporters isn't something that I thought about too much previously, but it is an elegant way to open the door to future games exploring the Lamorn, and I can understand why Tanabe might have liked the idea of doing so. That said, while some people have described this as a cliffhanger ending that invites a sequel, I don't really see it this way at all, but we'll get to that shortly. I also like the idea of symbolism baked into the concept of the Reavers being front and center in the design. It's certainly true that usually with space pirates, they are an external enemy, whereas here there's a sense of Reavers representing the road not taken. It's far more moving to fight the Reavers than it is to fight the space pirates, because you know what they once were. It seems that the green crystal cloud seeding as a kind of blood moon style event was a later initiative but flows into the story. Yet again, narrative form follows gameplay function. Let's pivot to the next section then. A Nintendo Dream asks, let's talk about Sylux. He had a brief appearance in the previous game, Metroid Prime 3, but he still remained a character shrouded in mystery. What led you to finally give him the spotlight in this game? Tanabe says, during the development of Metroid Prime Hunters over at Nintendo Software Technology, the game designer came up with concepts for all of the game's hunters. Among them, Sylux's concept was that he held a grudge against Samus and the Galactic Federation. At the time, in an effort to expand the Metroid Prime universe, I was thinking about potential spin-off titles I'd like to create, so even if he might already have had some ideas in mind, I asked him not to establish any concrete backstory. And while I was laying the groundwork with the 100% endings of Metroid Prime 3 and Metroid Prime Federation Force, I would think to myself, I'd really like to make a game centered around Samus and Sylux someday. it would be a really long time until the occasion presented itself, and given my age, I figured that this new Prime title would probably be my last chance to make that game a reality. So I can see this game as the first chapter in the Sylux saga. I wrote Sylux to be an unscrupulous, vindictive, almost demonic kind of character, and from this game onwards, Samus will also be aware of him as an enemy that she cannot avoid facing and must defeat. Consequently, the score between Sylux and Samus has yet to be settled. However, this game took longer to finish than expected, and it's been decided that I will not be involved in the production of the series going forward. Therefore, while there are no plans for a sequel, I hope that Mr. Bata and Retro Studios can one day bring this story to a close. End quote. Okay, so there is so much here. Let's start with the obvious. Tanabe always thought that his age would preclude him from doing a full Sylux series, and now it's become clear that he won't. Now, the translation uses the passive voice. It's been decided that I will not be involved in the production of the series moving forward, which is curious as it doesn't necessarily mean that Tanabe wouldn't be open to it, but I understand completely that Nintendo wouldn't want their lead producer to potentially retire midway through a major project such as a new Metroid Prime. It doesn't formally confirm, as it appeared from early translations, that he's currently retired, or even that he won't have a hand in other big imminent projects such as Luigi's Mansion 4, although I expect Ikebata to take on that project to a greater degree. On a personal note, I found Sylux one of the most frustrating parts of the game because even the flashback revealing his motivation doesn't, to me, say all that much. And while the character has an absolutely iconic look, I can't say it felt like an enormously satisfying resolution to the long mystery of who exactly this person was. The fact that there's an intention that it's left open is kind of odd to me, given that the tragedy of the ending is almost completely reliant on an assumption that the route back to this world is closed forever, but this was evidently not completely the intention. The contrast to me is with Ravenbeak in Metroid Dread, who built out the prior Chozo narrative and whose presence was at least retconned into the existing storyline through flashbacks near the end, but who made for a thoroughly satisfying one-and-done villain with a couple of terrific late-stage twists. The irony is that if they could think of an effective way for Ravenbeak to return, I think most people would be really excited, but the story feels like it has landed and concluded even as it is. At any rate, because Sylux's fate is left in the hands of Risa Tabata and Retro, it's not clear if Sylux actually will become part of a putative Metroid Prime 5. My guess is that they will indeed honour what's gone before, given how respectful they are to Tanabe's vision, but of course, Tabata may have her own thoughts, and it may be that they decide to explore a different corner of the Metroid skies for a bit, and keep Sylux on ice for a later entry, and create an original and surprising villain, or even return to one of the old favourites. Okay, Nintendo Dream next ask, please tell us about your method and the aspects you paid attention to when writing these scanning texts and logbook entries. Tanabe says, first of all, since this is written in the context of a computer's analysis, I have to choose my words so they won't convey any emotion and rather sound like the result of a logical and technical assessment. Moreover, since players won't feel like reading if there's too much text, I generally keep the descriptions to 3 lines displayed at once, and for longer descriptions, I try as much as possible to make it so you only need to advance the text once. Particularly for text that includes hints on how to progress through the game, I make sure to present all the information the player needs within that length with easy-to-remember keywords. Finally, this is just a personal preference, but I hate when line breaks happen mid-word, so I try as much as possible to make each line fit perfectly within the text box. This way of writing is influenced by the novelist Tatsuhiko Kyogoku. As for the actual content of the text, I aim to write it in a way that would naturally pique the player's curiosity and allow them to imagine things realistically. In particular, the research logs in Icebelt took a lot of work, as I needed to scatter keywords that would allow the player to piece together the truth behind the great tragedy, without giving it away completely, all the while making it feel like a real researcher's journal. I would have honestly liked to write the text that's fun to read like the Pirates logs, but this game setting didn't allow for it. That being said, I wasn't originally supposed to be the one writing the scan text. Until now, all the in-game text had been written by people from Retro Studios, but they no longer work there. So for this game, we hired a professional writer. However, being a professional, they prioritized good writing over smart writing, and that didn't quite fit what I was looking for gameplay-wise. It was also hard to get them to fully understand the game specifications, and since it would have been impossible to meet the deadlines as is, I decided to take over the writing myself. To be honest though, I was so swamped with work that I ended up making some mistakes in the fine-tuning stages. It was fun, but I shouldn't have taken that on. On the other hand, I left the Galactic Federation Troopers dialogue to actual writers, as I can't understand some of the nuances of the English language. For the Japanese version, however, rather than simply translating the lines, I asked the game designer Tarakudo to write them in a way that would sound more natural and fit the game and characters. End quote. It's kind of a pity that the computer analysis removes emotion, and it makes me wonder if avoiding this kind of situation was part of the thought process that Sakamoto had behind Adam in the 2D Metroid games. I want to say something more about Metroid Dread here, but it's still very possible that some people, unaccountably, won't have played it all the way through, but I do think the character of Adam is actually written very effectively to foreshadow something cool in the final act of that game. At any rate, although I've read a number of Japanese mystery series, I'm not familiar with the writing of Natsuhiko Kyogoku, but it appears that he has a rule that sentences never cross a page, break, meaning that readers are never obliged to turn the page to complete a sentence, something which I guess may make more sense in a language with some pictographic elements through the use of kanji. Still, it's a pity that Tanabe didn't find some way to create something like the Pirate's Logs on his latest game, as he obviously enjoyed doing so. It's also significant that previously it was both Tanabe and Tabata who pitched in to do this scripting, and Tabata was not involved at this point, which kind of feeds into my speculation that she had a much larger brief and was not necessarily quite as intimately involved with all aspects of Metroid Prime 4 during this particular window. Yet again, we get a sense of the stop-start nature of development, with the writing not being up to the standard Tanabe wanted. As for the Federation troopers, I wonder if he now regrets passing that on too, given the infamous cubicle fill line dominated discussions about the game for several days in the run-up to launch. While I think a lot of the things people criticize about the game seem to be directly from Tanabe, here I think this is actually a retro choice. Now, to be clear, while I'm not wild about the line, it doesn't send me into a rage as it does seem to for other people, and I find miles fine enough. I'm still now very curious about what the Japanese version might be like though, and I wonder if anybody has actually looked at it and translated it as of yet. Nintendo Dream then pivot to talking to Music Supremo Yamamoto, asking, what did you aim for and which aspects did you focus on when creating the background music and sound effects for this game? Yamamoto says, all of the music in the Metroid Prime series is composed by Nintendo, while the sound effects and voice acting are handled by Retro Studios. Since this game is a first-person adventure played through Samus's perspective, I composed the music imagining what kind of music I would be hearing if I were to set foot on Vuros myself. As for the sound effects, I worked with Retro Studios' audio team to create immersive sound effects that make you feel you're really there. After entering the jungle in Fury Green, you progress further and further. The melody you hear in the background transforms from that of a lush and beautiful jungle to one that entices you to explore its depths. As you progress through each zone, you'll also encounter scenes where some facilities change in certain ways, like when restoring the power or when lightning strikes. During these scenes, along with these physical changes, the music also transforms to create a very unique experience. For example, in Vault Forge, there is a scene where a flock of flight drones begin to swoop down on Samus and the lightning strikes. For this scene, I prepared music that will send a chill down your spine and give you goosebumps. Another example is the cold and icy research facility, where the music gives the player courage as the place starts changing. For the theme of the new bike, Viola, I made the music feel energetic. As for the main theme, I made it to reflect Samus's emotions during her adventures on Vuros. Every track in the game was made with Samus's perspective in mind. I really hope that players will become one with Samus and enjoy everything that Planet Vuros has to offer through its music and sound effects. End quotes. Now, personally, I really like the music in Metroid Prime 4, but I'm not someone with a tremendous ear for musical nuance, and so I won't comment further on this. Nintendo Dream next ask, this game felt like it put more attention into the ease of play than past titles. Were there any particular considerations you had regarding the overall difficulty? Bill Vandervoort replies, this game will likely be to some people their first Metroid Prime game and the long-awaited return to the world of Metroid Prime for others. To make sure the game would be enjoyable by everyone, we reused elements from past Prime titles in a way that could draw in new players while moving the Metroid Prime saga forward. The story and characters also had their importance and were driving factors in some design decisions. For example, most zones start with a linear path, allowing us to tell the story of the Federation troopers who appear there. We wanted to motivate the player through a familiar narrative structure. While there are still opportunities to backtrack and explore when you first visit an area, the game's structure is definitely not as intricately woven as the original Metroid Prime. But if the player returns to these zones later in the game, they can have new experiences and make small discoveries, especially if they return with new abilities. This is meant to reward players with a lot of curiosity, players who want more freedom to explore, or players who wonder what could be happening in this zone now that the main plot is over. And of course, we've made sure that players can thoroughly enjoy facing enemies and bosses regardless of their skill level. We made countless adjustments and improvements to ensure that you'll feel a sense of relief and accomplishment when you overcome an obstacle. They also ask, this game offers plenty of options, like choosing between gyro commands and mouse controls, but for serious newcomers specifically, are there any settings you'd recommend? And Bill Vandervoort responds, we did put in a lot of control options, huh? For a first-time player, I recommend starting with the difficulty settings, and once you've gotten familiar with the gameplay in the first zone, you can try out different options. There are some settings like the camera sensitivity or inversion that you could also adjust to your liking right away. The lock-on free aim feature, which allows you to aim freely while locking onto an enemy, can be used with any control method. Gyro, the R-stick, the Switch 2's mouse. You can try out any of the controls at any time. And if you want to go further, you can even remap the controls by swapping button inputs. End quote. So this is all really interesting as well. One of the criticisms the game has received is the relatively linear structure of some of the areas, which I think is especially obvious in Fury Green, but it does make sense if they were keen to streamline all of this for new players. Also, while Metroidvania-type experiences have gained greater cult followings in the last decade with Ori, Yoku, Hollow Knight and others, in 3D, I'm not sure there is too much in the way of precedent, and in any event, I can understand the developer's caution back in 2016 at least. Whether a subsequent game would be more experimental remains to be seen. Now, the last section contains full-fledged ending spoilers. I'm going to read the whole thing through, and then we'll analyze afterwards. Nintendo Dream Ask. With this being the first numbered entry in the Metroid Prime series in a while, I would like to ask once again about the themes you incorporated into the game and the messages you wanted to convey to the player. Tanabe says, it has been over 40 years since I joined Nintendo. Now, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is the last game I will be making at Nintendo. Even so, rather than making anything special, I simply worked with Retro Studios on delivering a fun and unique experience for players of all types and all ages, just like previous Nintendo games. I hope with all my heart that this game will create long-lasting memories for everyone who plays it. And for those who have yet to play it, I hope you will get to experience the world of Vuros through the eyes of Samus. Nintendo Dream also asked what was Sylux exactly up to after arriving on planet Vuros. Tanabe says, Sylux was severely injured following the teleportation. By chance, he was sent to the pinnacle of Chrono Tower. He slipped into one of the healing pods located there and linked with Chrono Tower. That allowed him to obtain information from the Lamorn and learned that to escape Vuros, he would need to use the Master Teleporter and that 5 Master Keys were required to activate the teleporter. Using the Sylux Metroids that were transported alongside him, he then tried to control the minds of the Key Guardians and obtain the keys. However, the Key Guardian's willpower far exceeded the Sylux Metroid's mind-controlling ability, leading the fused creatures to lose their minds and become enraged and hostile. Sylux's recovery was a slow one, and he was essentially unconscious during this time. However, in his awake moments, he would send the Cybots against Samus in an attempt to steal the keys she had obtained. Upon awakening, Sylux's mind briefly linked with Samus, which allowed her to see his memories in the form of flashbacks. Nintendo Dream asks, please tell us about the teammates from the Galactic Federation Army. What led to the creation of these characters and the cooperating with teammates plot, which is rather unusual for this series? Tanabe says, I actually don't play that many video games. I instead watch a lot of films. I majored in film production in college. Therefore, when designing a game, I rarely analyze or study other games, and rather than thinking solely about the game systems, I place the emphasis on creating as many wow moments as I can and defining the theme I want to express through that game, all from the angle of how can I create emotional ups and downs for the player. In fact, this entire game was designed starting from said theme. With Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, I wanted to try to make a game where, at the very end, when pressing the A button usually means finishing it, the player would instead hesitate and feel conflicted. Actually, I already did this once in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, but for this game, I really wanted to leave the player confused, going, "What? This is how it ends?" as the credits roll and leave a long-lasting memory. I'm expecting some negative reactions, but I've always found films that leave you with a lingering feeling in your heart more memorable than films with a happy ending, so I challenged myself to do that in a game. So, I conceived the final scene first and designed the game's overall structure around that. To that end, I created the Federation troopers who would fight alongside Samus and plan the gameplay so that as you progress through the game, the bonds between them and Samus, and therefore you the player, would deepen. I actually had even more events planned to deepen those bonds, but due to time constraints, they had to be cut. That is my one true regret." End quote. First up, this is the most direct acknowledgement that Metroid Prime 4 will be his last game, although, of course, because he does have a number of projects that his department is involved in, while, as I say, I expect Ikebata to be taking the lead on Luigi's Mansion, it's still possible that Tanabe will receive credits on games for quite a while to come, even if they're only special thanks credits. Also, over 40 years is an absolutely astonishing stint at Nintendo, and although it's far from uncommon for people at that company, I think it's easy to overlook how amazing it is that Nintendo have managed to cultivate an environment where so many talented people are gathered together and become so loyal. As for the specifics of the plot, I haven't replayed the game yet, but this explains a lot more than I got from it the first time in terms of exactly how Sylux's plot worked. So, firstly, we learn that Sylux's Metroids were part of how he managed to control the minds of the Guardians, which is interesting as we do see them at the very beginning of the game briefly, but not afterwards, leading some people to make the accusation of this being a Metroid game without the title character, which of course Zelda already did as long ago as Link's Awakening. Perhaps if Vuros were intended to be the centre of a subsequent game, the Metroids would therefore be able to factor in more, as clearly there were some Metroids on Vuros during the time of Beyond. Speaking of Link's Awakening, this is obviously a huge influence on the ending. Now, okay, this is a tough one. First of all, I do agree with Tanabe that having a bittersweet ending can be incredibly effective, and I absolutely love Link's Awakening. It is one of my all-time favourite games, and partly this is nostalgia for the Game Boy original, and a lot is due to the music and more, but a significant amount of it is the plot, including that ending, which is so delicate and perfect in its brilliance. I completely understand Tanabe wanting to recreate that kind of ending for Samus, and I also think it's a powerful mirror to Sylux, who leads soldiers to their death, for Samus to end up being in a similar spot. There is a kind of perfect symmetry to it. What emotional consequences this might have for her are unlikely to be developed, but it is interesting, and who knows, we might see more of this in Metroid Prime 5, especially if it leads to her rejecting working with other people. I don't think it's intrinsically a bad thing to have a game where Samus develops relationships in extremis with a number of other characters and they are ultimately led to their deaths. Frankly, at many points through the game, I kind of expected that they would all die quite a bit earlier. I'm kind of intrigued by what exactly Tanabe means by deepening those bonds, though, as it does speak yet again to what appears to be an astonishing amount left on the cutting room floor. My guess is that there must have been a point where Nintendo basically brought the hammer down and said, no, the final deadline is the Switch 2 launch window, which is completely understandable after such a protracted development period and given the commercial considerations of the need to launch around Switch 2, but it might also explain some other aspects of the development. Then again, since many people dislike the Federation Force, perhaps this wasn't something that would have been much missed. Perhaps in a future interview we'll learn what those relationships were. I suspect, in particular, there was more to do with View, who didn't actually have any particular section of his own. In particular, because of the choice to have Samus be utterly mute, there's no real chance of developing these relationships in a bilateral way, and I think this is something that doesn't seem to be acknowledged in this interview, and I do wonder about that particular choice. One other possibility I wonder about is whether there were aspirations to have more areas. For a game with the ambition of Metroid Prime 4, it feels like there could easily have been more than just the 5 main areas, and of course a 6th area would have allowed more scope for View to be involved. The Great Mines could easily have been central, and a different area could have been located in the northeast, perhaps a fuller level, full of temples, of the style of Chrono Tower. Instead, Fury Green feels cut short and we get temples absorbed into it. At any rate, let's hope one day we do find out more. I also speculated previously about whether the very final end of the troopers was tacked on late in the game. It seems so random to me, Sylux just popping back from the dead and forcing the players to choose when the player already effectively made this choice individually in the Great Mines. It feels far more logical for me to have the ending take place in the Great Mines and have Samus only pause to realize the horrors that she's gone through after everyone else is dead. However, the core concept of the game appears to have been the player being forced to hit the A button to commit to a future about which they may have mixed feelings. With this being framed as just Act 1 of the Sylux saga, bringing back Sylux after his supposed death must also have been deliberate. Now, it's possible, of course, that there could have been different versions of this, and one that was more subtly paced that had to get cut for time, but it does seem a little bit like this was just the key concept from the very beginning. Now, for me, one of the issues with the execution is this sense of it being a little bit unearned. The fact that Sylux emerges after he is supposedly defeated, the fact that the Federation Force troopers survive all sorts of terrible things, and yet at the end meet a terrible fate. Whereas in Link's Awakening, the choice is staring at you ever more as you approach the Windfish, so there is plenty of time in the game for the player to feel a sense of gnawing dread about what's to come. There's just a moment of relief at the end, with Marin potentially, in a certain way, surviving. Now, all of this is completely consistent with the pacing of the Great Mines, forcing you to serially sacrifice all of the people you've worked with. It does have a strong sense of pace being built up, but this is not consistent with the final showdown as it plays out, and I think that abruptness rather than the concept is what bothers me, and I think this is a pity personally. Now, the most straightforward explanation with all these kinds of things is usually that despite the compromises and regrets that are always involved with making games, and particularly with making games of the complexity that Metroid Prime 4 seems to have experienced, the games are ultimately what Nintendo wanted to make, and certainly this seems to be Tanabe's game to a much stronger degree even than some of the previous Prime titles, where we know that, for example, Rita Tabata was very heavily involved. Whether there's even another game, let alone one that reprises the Lamorn and Sylux, remains to be seen, but I think there is a very strong chance that Nintendo will pivot more heavily than they might have done if the game were received more warmly. At any rate, that's it for this interview. Huge thanks to Shine Sparkers and Darts for the translation, and of course, please do check out the Patreon below, and also like, comment, and subscribe if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.